They told me my 21 years of service were a liability, not an asset. The phrase Julian Croft used was a legacy mindset incompatible with forward-facing agility. It was corporate jargon for "you're too old" and "you follow the rules too closely." He said it with a thin, self-satisfied smile, the kind a man gets when he believes he holds all the cards. He was wrong. My name is Raymond Foster. I'm 53 years old. And until that conversation on November 15th, 2024, I was the Chief Compliance Officer for Omnicorp Global, a position I had held for the last 9 of my 21 years with the company. I was, for all intents and purposes, the institutional memory and the corporate conscience, two things Julian Croft had no use for. The boardroom on the 48th floor was all glass and chrome, overlooking the city with an arrogant sort of calm. It smelled of expensive leather and the faint citrusy scent of the cleaning solution they used overnight. Julian, all of 38 years old with a Wharton MBA and the son of a major board member, stood at the head of the mahogany table. His Brioni suit probably cost more than my first car. The other board members, people I'd worked with for over a decade, refused to meet my eye. They just stared at their immaculate blotters or their iPads, their silence a form of loud, clear consent. "Raymond, we appreciate your long tenure," Julian began, his voice smooth and practiced, like he'd rehearsed this speech in front of a mirror. "But the board has decided to move in a new strategic direction, one that requires dynamism. We need to be nimble, to pivot, to disrupt. Your approach, while thorough, has become a bottleneck." A bottleneck. That's what he called it. I was the man who had single-handedly navigated the company through the Sarbanes-Oxley implementation, who had saved them a conservative estimate of $250 million in regulatory fines over 2 decades, who had personally built the compliance framework that allowed them to go public in the first place. I was a bottleneck. The numbers on the page didn't lie. Under my watch, Omnicorp had a perfect regulatory record, not a single material finding from an SEC audit, not one major compliance failure. But perfection, I was learning, wasn't profitable enough. He slid a folder across the polished table. It stopped perfectly in front of me. "This is a generous severance package, reflective of your service. We'll have security escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings." The humiliation was the point. The public execution in front of the board. The mention of security. It was a power play, designed to make me feel small, obsolete, and discarded. I felt a cold, dead calm settle over me. My knuckles didn't turn white. My jaw didn't clench. I simply looked at Julian, really looked at him, and saw the profound, bottomless depth of his ignorance. He saw an old man in an off-the-rack suit. He had no idea he was looking at the man who had built his prison, brick by meticulous, brick. What Julian didn't understand, what none of them in that room understood, was that my caution wasn't a personality trait. It was a weapon. And for 21 years, I had been documenting every single round of ammunition. If you appreciate stories about corporate karma, where the quiet professionals who do the real work finally get the recognition they deserve, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. You're going to want to see how this ends, because every detail matters. My history with Omnicorp began in 2003. The company was a fraction of its current size, operating out of a cramped office space above a bakery. I was 32, recently hired as a junior analyst in the finance department. The founder, Arthur Vance, was a brilliant engineer, but a terrible record keeper. He saw me not just as an accountant, but as someone who could bring order to his creative chaos. I was the one who built the systems, created the filing protocols, and wrote the first employee handbook. I sacrificed for that company. In 2009, I missed my daughter Sarah's 10th birthday because I was flying to the Brussels office to handle an emergency internal audit. The local manager was cooking the books, and I had to work 72 hours straight to unravel the fraud before it brought the whole European division down. I sent Sarah a postcard, of the mannequin piece. It felt like a hollow gesture even then. I was there for every late-night filing, every weekend crisis, every holiday that was interrupted by a regulatory data call from the SEC. My wife, before she passed, used to joke that I was married to Section 12B of the Securities Exchange Act. My value wasn't in flashy presentations or buzzword-filled strategy sessions. It was in the quiet, unseen work. I was the foundation. I was the one who knew that the server room's fire suppression system hadn't been properly certified since 2018. I was the one who knew our patent license for a key piece of software in our flagship product was set to expire in 6 months, something the tech division had completely forgotten. I was the one who personally managed the relationship with our most difficult and most profitable client, a man who trusted me because I had never once lied to him about a deadline. This was the institutional knowledge that doesn't show up on a balance sheet, and it was the very thing Julian Croft was about to throw in the trash. Julian arrived 11 months ago. His father, a longtime friend of Arthur Vance's family, had leveraged his board seat to get his son the CEO position after the previous one retired. Julian came in like a storm, armed with a freshly printed Wharton diploma and a vocabulary consisting of about 4256, 4704 corporate buzzwords. He talked about synergy and disruption, but couldn't read a cash flow statement without his CFO, Marcus Thorne, pointing to the right lines. He drove a pearl-white Tesla Model S Plaid, which he'd often leave parked across 2 spots in the executive garage. He saw my meticulous, rule-based approach as an affront to his genius. He wanted to move fast and break things. I was the man whose entire job was to make sure things didn't break. The breaking point came in February 2020. No, wait, that's not right. The real turning point was much earlier. Back in 2008, the company was navigating the financial crisis. We had a close call with an SEC inquiry into our revenue recognition practices. We were clean, but it was a wake-up call. One evening, Arthur Vance called me into his office. He poured 2 glasses of Macallan 18. He looked tired, older than his 65 years. "Raymond," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "I built this company on good engineering and honest dealing. But the world is changing. The people who will run this place after I'm gone, they might not see things the same way. They see quarterly reports, stock options, golden parachutes. They don't see the long game." He took a slow sip. "I want you to keep your own records," he continued, his voice low and serious. "Not on the company servers. A separate, private log, emails, memos, your own notes from meetings. Everything. If the day ever comes that integrity walks out that door, you make sure you have the receipts to prove it was never yours that left. Protect the company. But first, protect yourself." That night, I went to a computer store and bought an external hard drive, a simple 500 gigabyte Western Digital. It was the first of many. For the next 16 years, I followed Arthur's advice with the same methodical precision I applied to everything else. Every time an executive suggested we creatively account for R&D expenses, I saved the email. Every time a sales VP wanted to book revenue on a deal that wasn't signed, I documented the conversation. Every meeting where a risky, borderline illegal strategy was discussed, I took detailed, time-stamped notes on my personal laptop and saved them to the drive. I created a system. Each file was encrypted, categorized by date, project, and individuals involved. I had folders labeled Project Nightingale, Q2 2022 Revenue Reclassification, and Odysseus Defect Concealment. It wasn't an act of malice. It was an insurance policy, a historical archive. Arthur Vance had taught me that the best compliance tool was a perfect memory. My archive was that memory, incorruptible and absolute. My personal stakes were simple and stark. I'm a widower. My only daughter, Sarah, just started her first year at Northwestern. The tuition is $72,000 a year. My severance package, while Julian called it generous, was the legal minimum, 6 months' pay. With my reputation now painted as too cautious, finding another chief compliance officer position at my $450,000 a year salary would be nearly impossible. I stood to lose my house, my retirement, and my ability to give my daughter the future her mother and I had always planned for her. Julian Croft wasn't just ending my career. He threatening my entire life's work, both professional and personal. After security watched me pack the few personal items from my desk, a photo of my late wife, a framed picture of Sarah at her high school graduation, my favorite coffee mug, I walked out of the Omnicorp building for the last time. I didn't look back. There was no anger, no panic, just a quiet, focused resolve. I went home, walked into my study, and unlocked the fireproof safe in my closet. Inside were 5 encrypted hard drives, neatly labeled. The project I had unknowingly been working on for 21 years was about to enter its final phase. My response was not emotional. It was operational. I approached it like any other compliance audit. I spent the first week organizing my data into a narrative. I created a master document, a detailed timeline of every significant regulatory breach, attempted breach, and conspiracy to commit a breach since 2008. Each entry was cross-referenced with supporting evidence from the drives. Emails with full headers, scanned memos with signatures, even audio notes I dictated to myself immediately following key conversations, all timestamped by the file's metadata. Julian, meanwhile, was basking in his newfound freedom. 2 days after my termination, he sent a company-wide email with the subject line, "A New Era of Innovation." He wrote about removing bureaucratic hurdles and empowering our teams to think outside the box. It was a declaration of war on procedure and regulation. He and his hand-picked executive team, Marcus Thorne, the sycophantic CFO, and Brenda Walsh, the ruthless COO, believed they had finally unshackled the company from my cautious grip. Their arrogance was their greatest vulnerability. They assumed I had gone home, a defeated old man, to lick my wounds and update my LinkedIn profile. They never imagined the true nature of my personal files. They didn't bother to conduct a proper digital forensic sweep of the systems I had built and managed. They were so busy celebrating their victory, they didn't see the trap closing around them. I knew for sure 3 weeks ago when I got an alert from a monitoring service I'd set up. They had filed their quarterly 10K report with the SEC. I downloaded it and read it with a growing sense of clinical detachment. It was a masterpiece of fiction. They had booked $42 million in revenue from Project Nightingale, a software deal with a European conglomerate that I knew for a fact was not finalized. I had the email chain from Julian to Marcus Thorne, dated October 28th, that explicitly said, "Book it anyway. We'll sort the paperwork later. We need to hit the street's expectations." That single email was a direct violation of SEC Rule 10b-5, a classic case of securities fraud. The evidence was ironclad. I had Marcus Thorne on a recorded conference call, a call where all participants were notified of recording for quality assurance, a policy I myself had implemented, discussing a plan to backdate stock options for the executive team to a low point in the stock's price from the previous month. That was wire fraud. I had a series of memos from Brenda Walsh, the COO, detailing a plan to conceal a known hardware defect in their new Odysseus line of network servers, a defect that could cause catastrophic data loss for their clients. She called it a managed risk. The law called it fraud and reckless endangerment. My compilation was more than just a collection of files. It was a 21-year story of escalating corporate malfeasance, told through the company's own words. I prepared a 30-page summary document, citing specific statutes and regulations for each violation. It was the most important report I had ever written. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after I was fired, I made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, not to a journalist, but directly to the whistleblower office at the Securities and Exchange Commission. I introduced myself, stated my former title, and calmly said, "I have credible, first-hand evidence of ongoing material securities fraud at Omnicorp Global, perpetrated by the senior executive team." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with professional interest. I was assigned a case number and told an enforcement attorney would be in touch within 48 hours. The call came in 24. The absence of my bottleneck was having the exact effect I anticipated. Without me to pump the brakes, Julian and his team went into overdrive. They launched the Odysseus servers, knowing they were defective. They announced a major new partnership based on the fraudulent revenue from Project Nightingale. The stock price soared 12% on the news. Julian was hailed as a visionary on financial news networks. He was at the absolute peak of his arrogance, convinced he had outsmarted the old system. My withdrawal wasn't just a matter of compliance. The little things started to fall apart. The junior analyst I had mentored, a bright young woman named Chloe, called me a few times, unofficially. She told me the renewal for the company's master insurance policy had been missed because the automated reminder I had built had been decommissioned during Julian's streamlining. A critical software license I managed had expired, taking down the entire internal accounting system for 2 days at the end of the quarter. The big client I used to handle personally was threatening to pull his $80 million a year account because Julian had tried to bully him into accepting new terms. The chaos was building, a slow-motion collapse that only I could see the true scope of. The real emergency, however, was being prepared in the quiet, sterile offices of the Department of Justice. I spent 3 full days with a team of 3, an SEC enforcement attorney, an assistant U.S. attorney from the Southern District of New York, and an FBI agent who specialized in white-collar crime. I sat at a cheap government issue table and walked them through 2 decades of corporate rot. I was calm, precise, and objective. I wasn't a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. I was a compliance officer filing his final report. I handed them a new, perfectly organized hard drive containing the entire archive. They listened. They asked clarifying questions, and by the end of the 3rd day, the AUSA looked at me and said, "Mr. Foster, you've just handed us a prosecutorial grand slam." The stage for the reversal wasn't a boardroom. It was the Omnicorp company atrium. It was March 15th, 6 months after my firing. Julian had called an all-hands meeting to celebrate their record-breaking quarter, the very quarter built on the fraudulent foundation I had exposed. Chloe texted me updates from the event. Julian was on stage under a massive Omnicorp Innovation Unleashed banner, giving a speech about their incredible success. He was thanking his leadership team, Marcus Thorne and Brenda Walsh, who were sitting in the front row, beaming. He was at the height of his triumph, basking in the applause of employees who had no idea their leader was a crook. And then, at 10:17 a.m., according to the timestamp on Chloe's text, the world changed. The main glass doors to the atrium slid open, but instead of late employees, in walked 12 men and women in dark blue jackets with 3 gold letters emblazoned on the back. FBI. They moved with a quiet, purposeful efficiency that silenced the entire room. The applause died instantly. The celebratory music cut out. An agent walked directly up to the stage and handed Julian Croft a piece of paper. A search warrant. Chloe's texts became frantic. "Oh my God, Raymond, they're here. FBI. Everywhere. They just put Julian's phone in an evidence bag. Marcus Thorne looks like he's going to throw up. They're reading them their rights." The power shifted in the space of a single heartbeat. Julian's face, which had been smug and triumphant moments before, drained of all color. He began to stammer about his lawyers. Marcus Thorne did, in fact, get physically sick into a nearby potted plant. Brenda Walsh, ever the opportunist, made a move for a side exit, but was calmly intercepted by a female agent who seemed to have been waiting just for her. The employees stood in stunned silence, watching the corporate titans who had preached agility and disruption being treated like common criminals. My statement wasn't spoken in that room. It was being executed by the full force of the United States federal government. My archive was speaking for me, and its voice was absolute. My terms were simple and non-negotiable. I wanted full immunity from prosecution, which the AUSA granted without hesitation, classifying me as a witness, not a subject. And I filed for a whistleblower award under the Dodd-Frank Act, which entitled me to a percentage of any monetary sanctions recovered by the government. My work was done. Now, I just had to watch. The aftermath was a swift and brutal cleansing. Julian Croft, Marcus Thorne, and Brenda Walsh were indicted by a federal grand jury. The charges were extensive: securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and making false statements to the SEC. Julian's father's connections were useless against an airtight federal case. Julian was forced to sell his Tesla, his Hamptons house, and his collection of ridiculously expensive watches to fund his legal defense. The evidence was so overwhelming that his high-priced lawyers advised him to take a plea deal. He was sentenced to 7 years in a minimum security federal prison. His LinkedIn profile now just lists former CEO. There are no hashtags. Marcus Thorne, the CFO, was hit with 5 counts, including insider trading for selling a block of his own shares a week before the defective Odysseus servers were set to be recalled. He tried to save himself by testifying against Julian, but it only knocked a few years off his sentence. He got 4 years and was permanently barred from the financial industry. The last I heard, he was doing freelance bookkeeping for a string of laundromats in New Jersey. Brenda Walsh, the COO, decided to fight the charges. She believed her own hype. It was a catastrophic mistake. The prosecution brought in expert witnesses who testified that the Odysseus server defect she deliberately concealed had led to a catastrophic data failure at a regional hospital, endangering patient records. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. Her lack of remorse earned her the harshest sentence of all: 10 years in a federal correctional institution. The poetic justice was almost biblical. The very regulations they had mocked as bottlenecks and bureaucracy became the iron bars of their cells. The aggressive, risk-taking culture Julian had championed was cited by the judge during sentencing as a primary aggravating factor. My caution, the very thing I was fired for, was what made the case against them unassailable. The board of directors, the silent enablers who had watched me get fired, were forced to resign en masse in the face of dozens of shareholder lawsuits. The company's stock, which had soared on their lies, cratered. It dropped 82% in a single day of trading after the indictments were unsealed, wiping out billions in market capitalization. Omnicorp was delisted from the NASDAQ and forced into a painful restructuring under the watchful eye of a court-appointed monitor. I was restored, personally and professionally. 18 months later, the SEC announced that Omnicorp had agreed to pay a fine of $168 million to settle the fraud charges. As the primary whistleblower, my award was calculated at 28% of that amount. After taxes and legal fees, a check for just over $30 million was wired to my bank account. The first thing I did was set up a trust to pay for Sarah's entire education, all the way through whatever graduate degree she wanted. The second thing I did was buy a small, quiet cabin on a lake in upstate New York, the kind of place I'd been dreaming of for 30 years. I no longer had to worry about my mortgage or my retirement. The weight of financial uncertainty, a weight I had carried my entire adult life, was gone. I was finally, completely secure. I didn't return to the corporate world. Instead, I opened a small, specialized consulting firm, Foster Ethical Compliance. I don't take on many clients, only those who are serious about building a culture of integrity from the ground up. My reputation in the industry transformed overnight. I was no longer Raymond Foster, the too cautious CCO. I was Raymond Foster, the man who brought down Omnicorp, the man who held the line. My name became a byword for integrity and foresight. I charge $2,000 an hour for my time, and I have a 6-month waiting list. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. I was sitting on the porch of my new cabin last weekend, watching the sunset over the water. My phone rang. It was Sarah, calling from her dorm room at Northwestern. She was telling me about her political science class, about a debate they were having on corporate governance and ethics. She was passionate, intelligent, and happy. We talked for almost an hour, not once interrupted by a work emergency. After we hung up, I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the still, dark water. Justice isn't always about revenge. Sometimes it's just about restoring order to a system that has fallen into chaos. It's about ensuring that the rules, the ones designed to protect everyone, apply to everyone. Julian Croft and his team thought they were above the rules. They were wrong. They believed caution was a weakness. They learned, far too late, that it was just another word for preparation. And in the end, the person who is most prepared always wins. My work was finally, truly in compliance. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, smash that like button and leave a comment letting me know what you think. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to do so and hit the notification bell to get alerts about new stories like this one. I'll see you in the next video.